Hi there, folks. It's Ciaran here from Menlo Park Veterinary in today's episode of the Menlo Park Veterinary Recruitment Podcast. I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, Josh. Josh, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Ciaran. Very esteemed.
Indeed. And today's episode focus is on the rising cost crisis reshaping UK veterinary practice. Now, Josh and I have done a wealth of research into this, and I will mention at this stage that a number of our sources and citations are available in our citation list, which will be a separate document to this. But for the sheer sake of how the podcast will flow and how our conversation will flow, we're not going to quote every single one as we go, but the citation list, as I say, will be available to anybody who'd like to have a look. So to go over a few kind of key areas that Josh and I are actually looking at today, I think it's important to emphasize at this stage, as you and I have discussed already, Josh, this is a sensitive topic. Many listeners are living this reality on a daily basis, be they vet or pet owner. We have had a research approach to this, so this is months of data gathering as well as speaking with practices across the UK. On top of that, the promise of this episode is kind of breaking down numbers. We're going to look at some real life stories and, of course, some career implications. And then on top of that, well, anybody who, of course, wants to listen into the podcast is welcome, but this will really be mainly focused on career movers, potential practice owners, and industry professionals. So, Josh, if you would like to take us away on our first segment.
Sure, yeah. So, first segment. The numbers don't lie. We know that. So, first of all, I'd like to talk about average consultation fees, reaching £47.69 on average in 2024. Significant regional variations. So, in the sort of more rural areas, we're looking at about £32.50. And in the more expensive regions, believe it or not, Bournemouth being one of them, at £59 on average. Pet owners are reporting that consultation fees are obviously rising dramatically. I've had that experience myself. I don't know about you, Ciaran. And with one pet owner actually noting that costs increased from £70 to £250 for basic visits between 2019 and 2023. So only a 4-year difference.
Which I think we can agree is rather unfair in many respects, and of course it's staggering more than anything. For the price to more than triple in that time period. And I think something you've mentioned as well there, Josh, about the £59 in expensive locations like Bournemouth. I mean, I cover Bournemouth as one of my locations, and I speak to a number of vets there on a weekly basis who are saying things to me along the lines of they can't justify the prices that they're charging. They don't feel that what they're offering is fair to pet owners.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a real tragedy. It's a real sad situation, I think, at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So something else as well is the routine procedures. So veterinary costs have risen by 17% in a couple of years ago,
Wow.
with total UK vet bills exceeding, and I'm not making this up, £5
Mm-hmm.
billion annually. And yes, that was billion with a B. £5 billion annually. It's just staggering, what the kind of sector's worth in that respect. But there's real world examples of this. So there's one particular article that I read whereby it's referencing one dog owner who saw eye surgery costs rise from £800 to £1,750 in the space of just 2.5 years. So again, it's crazy the rate at which that's risen, and over such a short period.
Mm-hmm.
It's startling, to be honest, and
Yeah.
concerning for the sector.
Yeah, it is, and I think the price inflation has, as the CMA have stated, massively overstripped general inflation over the last sort of 10 years or so, leading to massively increased costs. Massive.
And then on top of the cost for the actual pet owners and the procedures and stuff, there's also staff costs. So we're looking at, veterinary salaries have shown consistent growth from 2020 to 2024, which was the end of this study that I've looked at, with entry-level salaries increasing from £37,000 per annum
Yeah.
to £41,000 per annum, which is a 10.8% increase. And mid-range salaries have grown from around 55,000 to 61,000. So similar, and that's a 10.9% increase over those 2 years. So again, they're rising costs in terms of paying salaries. Vet practices, to keep up with that, are having to raise the costs of procedures and surgeries and consults. And in 2024, the SPVS survey reported a median starting salary for new graduates at £34,000, which marked a 6% increase solely from the previous year. So whereas those other areas I've mentioned are over a 4-year period, in the space of 1 year, that had increased by 6%. And again, these new graduate veterinary surgeons are coming in, being paid a certain figure, and of course, in some cases, they are the predominant vet of a practice. Veterinary practice is taking on more than one new grad at a time in some cases, and therefore, to make it work, practices are having to charge what they're charging to be able to pay for their vets and their equipment and to keep the lights on. So, yeah, really, again, quite staggering statistics. I'm sure our listeners will agree.
Oh, yeah. Let's look at what's sort of causing some of these price increases then. So I think the supply chain has been massively impacted by Brexit. Brexit
Yes.
itself has caused significant and created significant concerns about medicine supply chains, with the BVA warning that border delays could hold up veterinary medicine supplies, potentially causing further welfare issues and shortages, obviously. Brexit could result, because we're still seeing sort of the backlash from this,
Yeah, we are.
result in 25 to 30% increases in medication cost due to tariffs and regulatory changes. Some veterinary medicines are actually seeing 50% increases due to supply chain disruptions. So that's 50% increases plus in costs and regulatory changes post-Brexit. Inventory challenges, so in terms of the supply and demand, practices are holding a larger stock because they're struggling to get things in as often, to try and sort of mitigate those supply risks, and they're tying up more and more capital and increasing their operational costs just by sort of bulk buying, if you like. The CMA actually found that medicines account for 20 to 25% of revenue in large vet businesses, with most pet owners unaware that they can actually obtain prescriptions from their vet, and they buy their medicines elsewhere, be that online or at a pet shop.
I do agree that I think that the last point you've mentioned there, Josh, is that a lot of pet owners are unaware of that. And I think sometimes it's, should we say, crime of convenience, in that pet owners, they think, right, I'm here, especially if they're people who work full time, and they've maybe had to go in on a day straight after work, or they're nipping in on a lunchtime or something, and they just think, right, for sheer convenience, I'll get it here. And in that respect, I'm not trying to paint all practices with the same brush, of course, but I think that there are some that are taking advantage of pet owners there, and I don't think it is clearly communicated that they can write a prescription and then they can buy it from, like you say, a pet shop or something like that. Because, and I appreciate at the end of the day that veterinary practices are businesses; they've got to run to a certain business model, they've got to work in a certain way. But at the same time, when it comes to what it really should be all about, which is the taking care of the animal, of the pet, or the farm animal, I do think that it should be made clearer, because I think that in some cases, as we'll go on to discuss, being able to get the same level of care and medication and such, but cheaper, can make a serious difference in the life of that pet and the owner.
Definitely.
Okay. Well, going off what you've mentioned there, Josh, again, as we mentioned at the start of this, we want to talk about some real owner experiences and such. And there's one particular article, I referenced it briefly earlier, but Dave Bicker from Leicestershire saw his dog's eye surgery cost rise by from £800 to £1,750 in just 2.5 years. And he is quoted as saying, "I've been quite shocked about the rising cost. I think there's a tendency to vets to adjust their prices to match the higher figures of their colleagues. There aren't cheap vets anymore." As a dog owner yourself, Josh, would you agree with that? Do you think there are no cheap vets anymore?
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, we'll go on to this a little bit later about corporate ownership, but
Mm,
I think corporates tend to have a bit more standardized pricing. So myself, I'm with a Vets for Pets practice, and I've been through a couple of Vets for Pets practices. The prices are all roughly the same. However, it is actually more than it is in Bournemouth. On average, my consults are £65.
wow.
But I've found that in terms of medication, consult, that's all roughly the same. Whereas independents, they have a little bit more freedom, and they're run by the owner, so they can
Mm,
change their pricing accordingly. I've spoken to some practices that are charging £40
mm,
for a standard consult. I've spoken to some that are charging 80. I mean, it can really depend drastically, and it also will depend on how affluent the area is as well,
mm,
and standardizing it around that. I think if you're in a more rural area where you're going to have less affluent people, we'll say,
mm.
then you're going to have to charge lower, or you're not going to get any business.
Do you think it's a case of maybe that it's not that we should be looking for cheap vets, but more fair value?
Honest vets,
Mm,
yeah,
yeah,
definitely
because I
honest.
think sometimes the word cheap can raise images of poor quality.
Hmm.
And I sometimes wonder maybe we shouldn't be looking for cheap vets. And I appreciate Dave's obviously said this in an interview, but in terms of a kind of the general audience to listen to, I think maybe don't look for cheap vets, but like you say, look for honest vets and look for vets that are good value.
And have a
You know,
good
if you
reputation.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, reputation's vital in the industry. But I think on the flip side of the real owner experiences, there's also the professional impact. For example, Valley Vets in Wales, their staff report that steep fee rises have led to more economic euthanasia. Now, this is a term that I know Josh and I have come across previously, but I appreciate our listeners might not have. So, this is
Mm.
where pet owners are opting to put down animals with good chances of recovery because they simply can't afford treatment, which I'm sure we can all agree is tragic. It's incredibly sad. And the impact that this is having on the vets who are then having to do said euthanasia and perform the actual procedure are saying, not being able to help the animals, which is what they've trained to do and what they love to do, is causing severe staff distress. Now, this is something we've touched on in a different episode of our podcast series, but
Mhm.
stress, burnout, it's all there in the veterinary sector for veterinary professionals, and it's an incredibly emotionally draining profession. And I take my hat off to vets, I really do, because I don't think it's something I could do, particularly the euthanasia side of things, especially if it's a healthy animal or an animal that may well make a full recovery,
Mhm.
but it's simply down to costs and affording things. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, yeah, immense distress being caused for these vets.
Yeah, and this is why a lot of the charities, RSPCA, PDSA, are all so overrun
Mm,
because people can't afford these prices. And you may have a perfectly healthy animal or an animal that is not perfectly healthy, but maybe needs an amputation, for example, and has very, very good odds, but you're having to put that pet down. And that's why there's such a long waiting list for RSPCA, for PDSA, and there's such strict requirements in order to get in there.
mm.
And it ends up that these healthy, or I say healthy in quotation marks, healthy animals are having to be put down, and it's heartbreaking.
It is. It really is. Yeah, it's tragic, and I think for me as a pet owner, it kind of hit home in the sense of it's something that I would never ever want to be in that position of doing.
Hmm.
Um, but I can imagine that for the vets who are having to do this, just purely down to cost, their hearts must absolutely break every time they're doing it.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I want to look at the corporate ownership trend.
Hmm.
Now, I know this is for you. You've spoken to a lot of vets from corporate practices. I mean,
I have indeed.
so have I. More vets from corporate practices want to speak to us than independent practices.
Yes, because a lot of them want to
Um,
leave.
yeah. So I mean, I couldn't believe this statistic from the CMA, who are actively doing an investigation at the moment. Is that corporate ownership has actually surged from 10% in 2013 to approximately 60% in 2024. So that's obviously being dominated by the big six, Pets at Home, who I'm with, CVS Group, IVC, Linnaeus, Vet Partners, and Medivet. They're dominating the market, and it's really representing a rapid consolidation in the sector. Now,
Massively.
yeah, the listeners and Ciaran, you're probably thinking, why is that happening? Why
I
has
am.
there been
I
such
am thinking
rapid
that.
consolidation? And it's actually, and we've covered a little bit of COVID-19 in our last podcast about
Hmm.
lockdown, where it's sort of due to COVID a little bit, and that's what sort of instigated the boom. Is that private equity firms and corporations sort of entered the market following a deregulation back in 1999. But the reason it became so attractive was to these corporate entities is because of the pet ownership boom, um, just after COVID and during COVID, when everybody was getting puppies. I can't quite remember that statistic that you quoted in the last podcast. I don't know if you can, Ciaran, about what the percentage increase of people owning puppies was.
Oh, I wouldn't like to say. I think if people would like to know that, they should listen to our other episode, which you can find in the link below.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, again, it is like we've touched on previously. COVID-19. I appreciate the outbreak was 5 years ago now at the time of
Wow.
recording this, but the impact of it is still being felt in many places, including the veterinary sector. Whether that's the owners feeling the effects, the veterinary practices feeling the effects, whatever it may be, it's still having a significant effect. And as you've mentioned, the pet ownership boom um, has made the sector attractive to investors. And I think the corporate, as you've said, the kind of the big six, if you will, the corporate structures are playing a different kind of game to the independents. There is more money there. They do have more practices. So therefore, chances are the location of a practice is better for somebody to commute to and such. So there is that, for want of a better expression, domination of the sector. But independents are making a comeback. As you've said yourself, the CMA are doing an investigation currently, and I, for one, cannot wait to see what the results are of that, because I think that will prove, I think insightful is probably the understatement of the century. I think it will really be incredibly eye-opening. But don't get me wrong, there are benefits to corporate ownership as well. This can provide economies of scale. There's better supply negotiations. There's financial stability for practices as well. Unfortunately, there are those independent practices out there that are closing or having to sell to corporate practices because there just isn't somebody to take over, especially in your more rural areas. There's one example I had actually recently of speaking to a vet on, I think it was the Isles of Scilly, I'm trying to think of now. Lovely independent vet, had been there for a long time, working as a mixed vet, of course, as you get in areas like that, and could not find anybody for love nor money to buy from them to keep it independent, and is seriously considering having to sell to a corporate, which is something they didn't want to do. But at the same time, it's better that the veterinary practice remains open than closes completely and leaves people in that region having to either travel so much further or even to the mainland in some cases. So yeah, it is, of course, there's pros and cons, shall we say? There's pros and cons, but there are concerns. I mean, the CMA identified multiple concerns about the market domination that I've referenced,
Yeah.
including potential for higher prices and reduced service quality, which is something that has been mentioned to me not only from vets who are working in these environments, but also customers. I think customers are really noticing a reduced service quality. One of our directors, Andrew, he was talking to me the other week about how a practice that he'd registered his 2 dogs with, I think 2 cats and numerous guinea pigs and other small mammals over the years. Wonderful independent practice. It was taken over by one of the big six, and the quality of service has dropped massively, to the point where he's now looking to register his pets at a different surgery, which is such a shame because you've got this factor again whereby he lives in a village. It's the most local practice to him in the nearest town. But again, if he's not getting the quality of service, why stay?
Yeah.
And workers have actually reported an increased pressure to meet revenue targets, with some practices seeing animals every 15 to 20 minutes.
And I mean, that's sort of quite a lot.
Hmm.
You
And
know,
this is why burnout's happening.
yeah.
There's too much pressure on these vets to
Mm,
hit these financial targets that I'm sure we can agree. We've both had conversations with vets where they say you don't go to university and study for as many years as you do to be a salesperson and hit financial targets. You do it to improve and save the lives of animals.
mm,
But in theory, veterinary surgery and veterinary nursing and working in the veterinary sector is a vocation, but people are doing a couple of years not not being able to deal with the pressure, and I say not being able to deal with as though it's a them problem, but the pressure is too much for anybody, and so they're leaving the sector entirely. And that's why veterinary surgeons, I think, should become a shortage profession because
yeah,
there's so few of them now.
yeah.
Really.
And just sort of following on from that, obviously there's going to have to be financial adaptations, and there have been in a few practices,
Mm.
namely a practice I'm working with have adapted quite well. I know you sort of mentioned that vets are becoming almost like salesmen,
Yes.
and it should be a vocation. It shouldn't be a sales role. So some practices are actually introducing full finance teams, and there is a practice actually quite sort of local who I'm working with at the moment, who have taken the pressure off the vets altogether and have an in-house finance team. So the vet will see the patient and the client, and the client will say, "Look, I need to go through insurance, or I need a finance option," and that vet can then actually step back and go, "Hold on a minute, I'm a vet. I don't need to discuss this. Speak to my finance team." And that sort of adaptation is becoming more and more sort of common
Mm.
within practices to take the pressure off the vets, and like you so mentioned, reduce that sort of burnout and reduce that high stress. Um, and as you mentioned, a lot of practices, a lot of staff at practices are feeling under pressure to charge for every small thing,
Mm.
and can be subjected to audits on what you call charge leakage or money lost when services aren't charged for properly. I spoke to a vet a couple of months ago who said that the computer system they were using wouldn't actually let her charge something incorrectly. It wouldn't let her charge something in a way that would be better for the client and better for the patient. She had to charge it as two separate things. And the computer completely said no. And she actually got an email from the HR team that had been flagged as to why she tried to charge it like this, and tried to explain herself, and got a bit of a slap on the wrist for it.
Which again in itself is just crazy to think, vets are doing what they can to help owners and help their pets. And then you've got this kind of sense of Big Brother is always watching, as
Yeah.
it were, to flag things like that. Again, vet surgeons are not salespeople. It shouldn't be up to them. They should be able to see the animal. And I think exactly like you've mentioned there, the practice that you're working with locally, great plug, by the way, um, is, it really is a situation whereby I think more and more practices should adopt that method. But
Mhm.
I mean, I'll be honest, I haven't had that with any of the practices I've worked with. I don't think there's been any with too much pressure on finances and sales targets and such, but they are certainly out there. And I think that sort of model sounds appealing. I mean, as a non-clinician myself, I can completely understand the appeal of that.
Mhm.
Um, as a pet owner, I can see the appeal of it even. So, um, and kind of building upon that as well, Josh, there are these workforce model changes that are being implemented. So there's a lot of extended nursing roles for
Mhm.
RVNs. So practices are maximising veterinary nurse skills to manage costs whilst maintaining service levels. So I think it's a case of now that if there's something that a veterinary surgeon doesn't need to turn their attention to, and it can be handled by a nurse, nurses are being given more trust to get these sorts of roles done. Um, there's of course the flexible staffing side of things, whereby if a veterinary practice can employ somebody on a part-time basis, that's of course appealing. There is still that market out there for some locum vets, especially in certain areas. Um,
Mhm.
there's telemedicine consultations as well to manage workforce costs. Um, and then, of course, you've got your workload concerns. So the corporate consolidation has led to increased workloads. For example, with Valley Vets that I referenced earlier, they're reporting the kind of stat that I mentioned earlier as well. They are reporting seeing new animals every 15 to 20 minutes, which again increases stress and increases the levels of a mistake being made, the risk of that. And of course, when it comes to the life of a being, an animal, mistakes can be incredibly costly. So we need to do what we can to avoid that.
Yeah.
But again, I just don't think that there is enough support for that in practices, sadly.
Yeah, and also we've got to look at it that sort of within that 15 minutes, the vet also has to do all the admin,
Hmm.
the write up as well. So that
Yeah,
the vet isn't actually seeing the patient for very long at all. You know,
no,
you're looking at what, 7 or 8 minutes, and then you have to write
if
the
that.
prescription. Yeah, if that,
Mm,
if that, and that's not the worst I've seen it either. I've seen 10-minute consult times.
mm,
And then you know you have an admin slot halfway through the day, which is great. But I mean that's not very good for the patients at all.
no.
And you're just seeing people six people an hour, 6 different patients an hour. That's crazy, crazy.
Especially, I think, especially what grieves people as well is that they'll have less than 10 minutes with their vet, and then the charge 60 odd pounds.
Yeah.
Of course, it's going to irritate people. Of course, it's going to um, push them away from wanting to come back, because why would anybody want to put up with that?
Mm,
It's not fair. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I do want to sort of look at some additional sort of services, service diversification, if you'd like. Some practices, I know that my vet practice does this. A lot of vets for pets practices are expanding into grooming, um, boarding, retail, another vets for pets at home thing, and wellness programs such as sort of puppy classes and older geriatric dog classes, to diversify their revenue streams. Um, Also, cross referrals as well is a big sort of money thing. The CMA are actively investigating practices that are referring pets for testing at other services owned by the same company. Often they're being referred without sort of transparency about common ownership. So that referral is taking place in house. And then, of course, you've got the technology investment as well. So
Mm.
investment in more efficient diagnostics, digital records, and AI to improve efficiency. I mean, I don't know if you've spoken to any practices or vets that have had experience in AI being implemented. It's quite a new thing. But I was speaking to an owner of a practice based in the southeast who said that they're implementing AI to actually listen into consult rooms to what the vet and the client is saying and do the notes for them. And all the vet is then required to do is, if a prescription is required, we'll have to sign off on it and just double check the notes.
I mean, as long as it works effectively and efficiently, it's ingenious.
Yeah.
Um, it could be that there's an element of trust behind it. I think it's certainly an area of interest, and I think it will be fascinating to see what comes in the next few years with that, because I can't imagine it's something that will be implemented in one or two places but never really take off. I
Yeah.
would imagine that there'll be a tremendous amount of success with a lot of it. I mean, we're talking specialist AI software as well. We're not just having people put stuff into ChatGPT. Other AI software is available, but it's a case of, I think that it's good to see that veterinary practices are trying to modernize and keep up with the changes of the world, and I think that that's something that's going to be vital moving forward. So I personally think it's a good thing to hear about. Um, yeah, so time will tell on that one, I suppose. But it's a financial catch-22, isn't it? Because there's the investment dilemma, whereby practices need that capital investment to improve efficiency, but are already financially stretched by rising costs. So they're teetering on the edge of a knife in many respects,
Yeah.
financially speaking. You've also got your market concentration, and again, as we've discussed, the CMA has found 40% of postcode areas could have competition issues, with 12% showing market shares above 30% for single corporate groups. So again, it's this sense of the market is not fair. You know, it is dominated by the big six, And then, of course, you've got practice closures because of either the big six taking over, or alternatively, just being outpriced and outmatched in terms of the independents that are closing. So, corporate owners may close practices to manage costs, as seen with some vet partner closures. They had 4 clinics in Wales closed not too long ago amid union disputes. So again, it's this sense of there's almost, I mean, I'm sure you and I will agree on this, Josh, but it'd be interesting to hear feedback from the listeners that there is no kind of perfect practice, in my opinion. I think every practice may well say it's trying to do the best it can for its pets, for its clients, but sadly, it's just, and for its vets, of course, but unfortunately, it's just not working in the way I think everybody would like. I mean, when we speak to tens of vets a week, how many of them say that their job's perfect? How many of them say they're happy with their job? Very few. Very, very, very few.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's a tricky position. And again, even as pet owners, Josh, there's some things that I would like my practice to do slightly better for my dog. There's certain things. I mean, I'm sure from what you've said about it being more expensive than the prices in Bournemouth, there's things that you would like your dog to benefit from with your practice. But
Maybe.
yeah. Mm.
Well, now I know. I think I'm going to have to move to a more rural area.
Well, move to
But
Bournemouth for a price decrease, mate. That sounds like a good option for you.
yeah, yeah. But then you have to sort of look at the rural impact. So obviously you've got with the practice closures and consolidation, that's particularly, as you've mentioned with our director Andrew, is going to impact rural communities, forcing longer travel time for even the most basic sort of checkup and care if it's just a booster jab. You've got delayed treatment, so that reduced sort of access and time it takes to travel often leads to more complex and expensive cases by the time you can take your dog or cat or reptile or exotic to the vet, and then when they're finally sought. And then higher costs are also leading to delayed care as well. So the costs are higher, so people are having to either save more or they're having to go through an insurance route or they're scared to go even if they don't have insurance. And that's leading to more complex and higher costs again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very tricky position. I want us now to look at the pet owner perspective, which again, you and I, for anybody who hasn't listened to previous podcasts, Josh and I both own cockapoos. We've both got our own dogs. And Josh, I know, has grown up with pets. I myself haven't, but I feel as though in the just over 18 months I've had my dog, I can completely empathise with pet owners about many, many things. So I think the behavioural changes statistics that are important to emphasise. So I want to start by talking about the cost burden. So 81% of UK pet owners reported in 2023 that it was more expensive to care for their pets than the previous year.
Wow.
Now, pet ownership has declined from 62% of households in the UK in 2022 to 57% in 2023. And this is linked directly with the cost of living crisis. So a lot of people, whether it's that they can't afford treatment when their dog does get to a certain point, whether it's that they're sick or ill, unwell, or if it's a case of they can't afford the insurance, they can't afford to pay for the food, they can't afford to pay for consults and basic medications. So we are seeing that these households are either putting their pets up for adoption, selling them, whatever it might be. And again, it is a burden for people. I appreciate that pets do come with a cost, but and the cost of living crisis certainly isn't helping on that front. But yeah, it's still a tragic statistic all the same.
It is. It is indeed. And then you've got to look at delayed care. So, I mean, 2024 statistics are limited. Um, the convergence of rising costs, low insurance adoption, and economic pressures strongly indicates increased delays in veterinary care. I mean, I myself am insured, but believe it or not, less than 10% of pet owners have insurance.
I think that in itself was a figure that when you first told me really shocked me,
Yeah.
because when I got Obi, my puppy, the first thing that everybody said was get insurance, get insurance, get insurance, get insurance. So it's really interesting to hear that less than 10% of the UK's population of pet owners
Mm.
have pet insurance. It's
Yeah.
it's it's yeah, really surprised me. And in terms of insurance and costs and such, the annual spending, veterinary costs have more than doubled over the past decade, with total UK vet bills exceeding that £5 billion I mentioned earlier annually. £5 billion.
A lot of
It's
money.
it's crazy. That's per year.
Mm.
That's per year. That's not over a length of time. That's, well, unless you say 12 months, but that's not over a number of years, I should say. That is in one calendar year.
Mhm, mhm. And relinquishment rates are at an all-time high. So 13% of UK households reported giving up a pet in 2022. Now that over doubled, rising to 28% among younger owners aged 16 to 24, often due to cost concerns,
Mhm.
which is crazy. And just touching on that pet insurance again,
Mm.
with less than 10% of pet insurers having insurance, it's leaving them out to be vulnerable to the high out-of-pocket costs. Premiums average for dogs at £156 annually. Seems quite cheap to me, actually.
It does to
And
me, yeah.
and and cat insurance at £82, but 24% of uninsured pet owners actually view insurance as not worth the cost, which is, of
It's
course,
it's
is worth
it's
the
it's
cost.
not worth the cost until you need it. That's the thing. It's
Yeah,
like the same with any insurance. A lot of people will feel aggrieved to pay various different types of home insurance, but when you need it, it's damn well worth it.
yeah, it is. It's that sort of cat and mouse and saying, oh, it's never going to happen to me, and
Hmm.
believing that that's never going to happen, and then it does.
It's better
Um,
to have and not need than need and not have. That's something I
exactly.
was raised to believe.
Exactly. Often with insurance, I mean, you have this with insurance throughout house insurance, life insurance, everything. There are coverage gaps.
Mhm.
So, gaps that the insurance doesn't cover the full cost of treatment, fees frequently exceeding policy limits, and forcing owners into those difficult decisions like giving up a pet.
Mm. Well, as well as that, there's the economic euthanasia that I mentioned.
Yes.
So it's not even just giving them up. Vets report increasing cases of this economic euthanasia where pets with these good recovery chances, there is a really significant chance they can make a full recovery, but due to the unaffordable treatment costs, they're having to put them down, which is just absolutely heartbreaking. Um, and then on top of that, you get regret rates. So 1 in 8 pet owners have regretted ownership at some point, often due again to a good old friend rising costs. It 1 in 8.
There's
It's
a
it's
pattern here.
yes, yeah, absolutely. And then you've also got your debt concerns. So if you have been able to pay for the treatment, but you've maybe had to do it on a credit card or something like that. 2022 Dogs Trust poll found that 1 in 10 UK dog owners have actually gone into debt to pay for their dog's care. Now, part of me thinks that's lovely that people would put their dog so high on a priority list. I would be prepared to do that for Obi because I love him to pieces. But I appreciate as well that it's not a good financial situation to be in. And it's a fascinating outcome of that poll.
So let's look at some of the coping strategies from a pet owner's perspective.
Yes.
So what are you going to do? More often than not, pet owners are calling multiple practices for cost comparisons before booking appointments.
Hmm.
I did that myself.
International treatment. Now, this is one that you and I both found fascinating when we were looking
Yeah,
into it. So,
we did.
some owners are actually now traveling abroad. So, I think our listeners will find this one fascinating to find cheaper treatment. And we found one particular example of a London chap who had his cat's teeth cleaned in France for €33. And this came after a quote of £900 for exactly the same treatment in the UK. Now, I'm not the strongest at maths, but I know that that is significantly better to head over? I mean, surely you could get the ferry or you could get the Eurostar over to France, have the treatment and come back, stay over for less than £900.
And
It's
probably have a day.
insane.
Yeah, and probably have a day in Disneyland Paris as well. For
I wouldn't go that far, but
it's-
I think you could certainly visit across the channel. But yeah, staggering, absolutely staggering.
and then at the same time, you've got self-diagnosis attempts as
Mm,
well. Now,
rarely end well.
they definitely rarely end well. I mean, the rise of Dr. Google. People are increasingly using online resources for what they perceive as minor issues,
Mm,
which is raising clinical concerns and it's delaying professional care. So again, then that is perhaps causing issues to get a little bit worse.
yes, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. And then of course there's your financing options, and this links back to what I mentioned about people ending up in debt because you've got growing use of PayPal credit, Klarna, different things like this in the general stratosphere of finance. And PayPal credit is particularly being used as what alongside specialized pet financing services to manage costs. So again, it's a case of it becomes quote unquote an affordable solution, but it's still putting people in debt because of interest and such.
yeah,
So it's tricky position for owners.
yeah. And in terms of a real sort of case example, a lady from Milton Keynes called Amy supposedly spent thousands of pounds on vet services, with her cat receiving repeated misdiagnoses of stress-related cystitis, when it was actually that the cat had cancer. She noted that the insurance is a massive help, but vets have you over a barrel as you have to pay their fee because you don't want your pet to suffer. On the other hand of that, because I don't think that's entirely fair for every vet,
Hmm.
um, vet staff are often reporting moral distress, and they feel like they're in the business of disappointing people
Mm.
due to cost barriers preventing optimal care. I personally have had quite a few vets say that, who are sort of looking, especially in corporate environments,
Hmm.
that they're, like we mentioned earlier, salesmen. And if somebody can't afford the treatment and they've got no finance options, or they don't get accepted for the finance options, then you have to turn them away.
Hmm. Yeah, which is not a position that vets really want to have to be in.
No.
Okay, so we're going to now look at some career implications and future outlook. Now, there is, of course, job market complexity to take into account when we're looking at this. So I think one of them is salary growth. So despite challenges, veterinary salaries have shown consistent growth. Cumulative increases of 10 to 20% across all ranges between 2020 and 2024. However, 47.4% of vets have reported that their earnings don't match their work. And I actually had a conversation about this earlier today, that especially with the excuse me, the extended hours in terms of having to stay late very often, or being on call, whatever it might be, which isn't sometimes part of a salaried role, isn't really financially accommodated for.
Mhm.
Um, and 52.6% don't receive any overtime compensation, which again I think links into if you are having to stay late, if you are having to do on call more regularly. On top of that, there is a skills requirement. Business skills are becoming as important as clinical competency, which again we've discussed. Vets are not going to university to become salespeople. Practices are requiring staff who understand financial management and client communication about costs. Now, I've spoken to a number of vets who are considering leaving the profession because they cannot stand having to have those conversations.
Mhm.
And again, this links back to what you've said, Josh, about some vets feel they're in the business of disappointing people, which is not what a vocation should be, and it's also not what they spend so much time and so much money learning to do through university. And as well as that, the third point I really want to raise is the workforce pressure. So there was actually the first ever strike at a UK private veterinary practice, which occurred at Valley Vets last year in 2024. And this was because workers were demanding fair wages and better conditions amid rising fees. So this is a kind of case of, fees are rising, but the vets aren't seeing the benefit of it financially speaking, and of course their conditions aren't improving. So it's just about money in the wallet of these corporates.
Yeah. So, what are the complications, you might be asking, listener and Ciaran? Um, Alternative opportunities is a big thing, and this statistic actually shocked me. 60.5% of UK vets would consider moving abroad for better pay, obviously indicating domestic compensation concerns, which
Mm.
links into what you said. I've spoken to a few vets who have done, a couple of years abroad. I actually spoke to a vet a couple of weeks ago who is in Canada and said that she's treated so much better and is paid so much better, and the staff, as in RVNs and support staff, are given a lot more autonomy. They're allowed to do things properly. And then you also got clinical autonomy concerns. So the British Veterinary Union chair, Susanna Hudson-Cook, noted that when practices are owned by private equity, the reinvestments are made on the basis of generating more profit rather than clinical needs. So investing
Mm.
in that new equipment or adding another part-time vet to share a workload.
Mm.
There's also that sort of specialization value. So high range salaries for your experience or more specialized vets showed the most dramatic growth, ending 2024 with 15 to 25% cumulative increases from 2020.
I mean, particularly the first point you've mentioned there, Josh, about the alternative opportunities. We're seeing this in other sectors as well. So here at Menlo Park Veterinary, we also have other sectors within
Mm-hmm.
Menlo Park recruitment, and one of them is international GP, and that desk is incredibly busy with GPs considering the opportunity to move to Australia or alternatively to Canada. And these two countries in particular are having a really big push to get UK qualified GPs, and we're seeing this with veterinary surgeons as well. That certain countries are making the push to have UK qualified vets go over there and work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, building on what you've said there, Josh, there's also the professional development strategies. So there's business literacy, which I've mentioned. So there's understanding practice economics, client communication about costs, and then financial management becoming an essential skill, which again is something that vets are not trained for, and they're having to learn on the job whilst also doing clinical work. Without enough time to do admin, without enough time to learn this properly, and it just becomes incredibly stressful. The strategic job selection, so the importance of choosing a financially stable practice with sustainable growth plans, is much more important for vets than finding a role with a high salary, or rather, it should be. And of course, we link back to it again, as so many things do seem to be nowadays. There's Brexit considerations. So the BVA, the British Veterinary Association, recommends adding vets to the shortage occupation list, as I've mentioned earlier, and guaranteeing working rights for EU vets to mitigate workforce challenges. We're seeing this with GPs. A lot of practices are actually having to offer tier 2 visa sponsorship licenses, and I think that this is needed in the vet sector. More practices need to be open to it, because otherwise, for want of a better expression, the best talent and the best vets out there will go and work overseas, will not want to come to the UK, and before we know it, we won't have any vets at all. So yeah, it's a stressful position to be in.
Yeah, yeah. So, how is it going to impact the future? What are the future industry predictions? So, let's look at the next sort of 5 to 10 years or so.
Mhm.
Um, so, continued consolidation will almost definitely happen.
Yes.
The CMA investigation that is currently ongoing may lead to regulatory intervention, but corporate ownership trends are likely to continue to grow.
Yeah.
Um, Technology integration, as I mentioned earlier, so the investment in AI, telemedicine, and automated systems to improve that efficiency and manage costs better. The regulatory response, so the potential again for government intervention, with the CMA considering remedies, which are pretty good, including fee caps and enforced ownership disclosures. And then obviously you've got the workforce evolution. So that's the sort of need for vets to be skilled in, as you said, both clinical work and business management to help navigate that changing landscape and that changing role. It's not enough to want to just be a vet anymore.
No.
You have to have that people skill, if you'd like, that sort of business head at the moment.
And financial know-how.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some immediate action items that we can discuss for professionals, and these are kind of some quick fire bullet points here. So there's skill development. So there are business courses, there's practice management, and there's financial literacy training.
Hmm.
So this is something that people can certainly look into if it is something that will help them in the profession. There's also industry awareness. So stay informed about regulatory changes and market consolidation trends so that you're up to speed and you've got your finger on the pulse with any new developments in the sector.
Hmm. And be flexible, career flexibility. So consider both traditional and non-traditional career paths in the ever evolving market, and professional support as well. So as we saw with the practice in the south of Wales,
Hmm.
engage with unions and professional bodies and advocate for fair working conditions.
Yes.
Um, and just sort of further on from that, resilience. Um, Basically, us saying, try not to worry. From a historical perspective, the profession has successfully navigated previous challenges, so
Mm.
including BSE, foot and mouth disease, and COVID-19, who was still getting a little bit of backlash from that. It's also an innovation opportunity. So the current sort of crisis, if you like, may catalyze some more positive changes in practice models and also individual professional development. And then collective action. So, as I just mentioned, the Valley Vets strike demonstrates that as vets and veterinary professionals, you can organise for sort of better conditions and fair compensation, and that you're not alone in feeling that way.
Mm. Absolutely. Very well said, Josh.
Thank you.
So I think that kind of covers everything that we're really wanting to discuss today. So in summary, we've covered rising costs affecting all stakeholders, practices, professionals, and pet owners. We've looked at the industry-wide challenge, so systemic issues requiring collective solutions and really trying to avoid individual blame. And we've also had quite an evidence-based discussion. So we've looked at statistics and stories backed by authoritative sources and recent investigations. And I will just add, again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, for anybody who'd like to see our citations and our sources, please do access the link that will likely be attached to this video so that you can see our list of references.
Yeah. And me and Ciaran and the rest of us at Menlo Park Veterinary invite everybody to share your experiences through our website, give us a call, social media platforms, so Facebook, LinkedIn. And if you ever need support or you just need to ask a question, then myself, Ciaran, colleague Lucy, Andrew, are always here for guidance and sort of navigating the changing market.
Wonderful. So to close then, we really just want to kind of reaffirm what an amazing job vets are doing. So if you are listening to this and you're a veterinary surgeon and you've maybe not had the best day or you're really quite stressed out, of course you can talk to us, but just keep in mind that the work you are doing is invaluable. It is incredibly important in terms of to pet owners, pets themselves, farmers, horse owners, whoever it might be. The work that you are doing is incredibly important, and you're doing an amazing job despite whatever challenges and issues are presented to you on a pretty much daily basis. So if Josh and I were wearing them, we'd certainly take our hats off to you. So take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I'm sure that we will see a positive transformation in the industry in no time. So um, it's goodbye from me, and it's goodbye from Josh. And thank you very much for listening, Josh. Thank you very much for joining me today.